The battle plan for Rafah is on the table. Once the fighting begins, Prime Minister Netanyahu predicts that the war in Gaza will wind down in a matter of weeks.
Well, plans for another hostage deal are underway. Even so, there will be no deal, Netanyahu says, until Hamas backs down from its crazy demands. CBN Middle East correspondent Julie Stahl has more.
This morning, Palestinian Authority Prime Minister Mohammed Shtayyeh submitted the resignation of his government amid pressure to shake up Palestinian leadership under 88-year-old President Mahmoud Abbas. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu told Fox News this morning that it's not enough.
No, well, first of all, I think that's musical chairs. They haven't had an election in the Palestinian Authority for 17 years, so they're just shuffling chairs. But the real thing we want to see is genuine de-radicalization. They have to stop teaching their children to become terrorists. They have to stop paying terrorists based on the amount of Jews they kill.
The U.S. says an outline is in place for a new hostage deal. It reportedly includes releasing 30 to 40 Israelis in exchange for a 6-week pause in fighting and hundreds of Palestinian prisoners. On CBS Face the Nation Sunday, Netanyahu says there can be progress only if Hamas backs down from its delusional claims.
Hamas started out with just crazy demands, and you know, it's too soon to say if they've abandoned them. But if they come down to a reasonable situation, then yes, we'll have a hostage.
In Geneva, hostage family member Ayelet Samarano is addressing the Future Beyond UNRWA summit on Monday. Her 21-year-old son Yonatan's lifeless body was kidnapped by Hamas terrorists, one of whom is believed to be an UNRWA social worker on October 7th. The summit follows revelations that at least 12 UNRWA workers took part in the attacks on October 7th, and more than 1,200 UNRWA staff belong to Hamas or Islamic Jihad. Netanyahu said Israel must achieve complete victory in Gaza, including taking on the last Hamas stronghold in Rafah. This morning, the IDF presented the War Cabinet with a plan for evacuating Rafah's civilians, as well as operational plans for the battle and for sending humanitarian aid.
Once we begin the Rafah operation, the intense phase of the fighting is weeks away from completion. Not months, weeks away from completion.
Netanyahu says that Israel will finish the war forced upon them by Hamas on October 7th.
What would America do? Yeah. What would America do, Margaret, if you faced the equivalent of 20 9/11s, 50,000 Americans slaughtered in one day, 10,000 Americans, including mothers and children, held hostage? Would you not be doing what Israel is doing? You'd be doing a hell of a lot more.
Julie Stahl, CBN News, Jerusalem.
Well, Michael Oren is with us now. He's the former Israeli ambassador to the U.S. And so, Michael, let's get right into it with the negotiations. On one side, you have Netanyahu saying the demands are unreasonable and delusional, and yet you have a delegation at the table. So what's the likelihood of an agreement?
Right now, I don't think particularly high. Listen, it's not just about Netanyahu. The conditions set by Hamas, which means Israel withdraws to the border, basically declares it has lost the war. Hamas comes back, rules Gaza, it rearms, it stages the next massacre of Jews. And in addition, they want us to release hundreds of terrorists from our jails who have killed hundreds, maybe even thousands of Israelis. And there was even a demand on the table that Hamas gets to control the Temple Mount, believe it or not. Now, this would be unacceptable to any Israeli, not just to Benjamin Netanyahu. I think even an Israeli on the far left would reject these conditions. So there's not much to talk about if Hamas doesn't back down from those conditions. Of course, we're going to try to do everything possible to get the hostages back. And we've proven twice in November that we're willing to pay a price for it, but a price that's within the logical universe. Of course, that would be acceptable to the vast majority of Israelis. Only that will bring about an actual hostage release deal.
Well, there is a history of unreasonable demands, and I'll just point out Yahya Sinwar, the head of Hamas, was in jail in Israel, in jail for killing 4 Palestinians who had agreed to cooperate with Israel. So he's a murderer. Allegedly. And he gets released. And it was, I believe, if my memory is right, 1,000 to 1 that 1,000 prisoners were released for 1 Israeli soldier. So given that history, do they have a claim here that they expect Israel will continue with this kind of unreasonable negotiation?
I think it was the last time we would ever agree to such a thing. I think we learned a very painful lesson. Because as you read your Bible, it says in the Bible that Jews must do everything in their power to release hostages, and even the Bible even goes to say that we should pay almost any ransom. It's very radical. So this is a deeply held conviction within the Israeli public, among the Jewish people, and it's very difficult for us to grapple with this problem of having hostages in the hands of Hamas. If they weren't in the hands of Hamas, our army would simply go into Gaza, fill up those tunnels with gasoline, and throw in a match. It would be that easy. But we can't do that. But there has to be a limit to what Israel is willing to pay for this. And I think Israelis have internalized this. We've learned the lesson of that deal in which Yahya Sinwar and 1,027 other terrorists got out of jail in return for one Israeli soldier, Gilad Shalit. We're not going to revisit that again.
Well, let's talk about the post-war plan. Netanyahu is calling for Israeli military presence and then a buffer zone on the border. Is there any foreseeable future where Gaza is back under Palestinian control?
I think that's the ultimate goal, is to find a Palestinian leadership that is responsible, that is more committed to the future of their children and grandchildren than they are to killing our children and grandchildren. And that may take a while. Keep in mind that Hamas has been ruling the Gaza Strip for a long time. It was raised an entire generation of Israelis, of Palestinians, who have learned literally before they walk that the most sacred thing they can do is slit the throat of a Jew. And you have to just simply watch their television, look at their summer camps, look at Palestinian Sesame Street, and see how they teach young kids to murder and butcher and behead people. And that's going to have to be undone. That can't be undone, just by an executive order. It means changing the entire sort of DNA of Gaza. So we have to find that type of leadership. Until that time, I see really no alternative but to an extensive Israeli security control over Gaza. There can be international involvement in reconstructing Gaza, an international involvement, maybe an inter-Arab involvement in the reconstruction of Gaza, but security control and a buffer zone. And I know the Biden administration said there can be no buffer zone. I think Israel's going to have to dig in its heels here. The United States is not about to give up the buffer zone between North Korea and South Korea. We have to ensure that no terrorists can ever get close to that border again. And the buffer zone we're talking about, which is really several hundred meters, is very, very, I think, a reasonable demand.
Well, can Israel even trust the international community here? I mean, you look at the history of UNRWA. I've been saying for years it should be defunded and it shouldn't exist anymore. But now we have revelation that they actually employed terrorists, members of Hamas. Their employees participated in the October 7th attack. I hear you that there should be international governance here for Gaza, but can you even trust it?
Well, I say governments, not security control. Security control has to remain in the hands of Israel for that precise reason. You can't trust them. And by the way, UNRWA absolutely must be dismantled. Not only because it harbored terrorists and used its schools as arsenals, but only because UNRWA is the only organization in the world that perpetuates a refugee issue. I mean, you are a refugee, a Palestinian refugee, even though your great-great-grandfather was a refugee, even though you have citizenship in another country. And by the way, keep in mind that the so-called refugees in Gaza, so-called refugees in Judea, Samaria, the West Bank, are by their own definition living in Palestine. So I don't even understand why they're refugees. That has to be dismantled, and a different school system has to be put in place, one that indeed teaches Palestinian children for peace and not for war.
Well, this morning, the Prime Minister of the Palestinian Authority announced his resignation. So is this just, as Netanyahu said, just musical chairs? Is there anything to this? Should we look at this as somehow a willingness for the PA to change?
Well, Palestinian prime ministers come and go. The question is whether the president will come and go. And now Mahmoud Abbas is in the 19th year of his 4-year term. He's not going to hold elections. He hasn't even chosen a successor, even by undemocratic means. The Palestinian Authority is deeply corrupt. It is despised by the vast majority of Palestinians. That's why Mahmoud Abbas will not run for re-election. And so a cosmetic change in various ministers of the Palestinian Authority who are unelected is not going to be a substantive change. I'll just say from a personal perspective, when I was in Knesset, I headed a classified committee where we looked at very sensitive issues. And among the issues we looked at was the Palestinian Authority's education. And we've talked about Hamas's education, but the Palestinian Authority was also teaching Palestinian kids literally where to stick the knife in a Jew's throat, how to draw that knife across the jugular. I used to come out of those committee meetings sick to my stomach. Now, that's the type of change we're going to need, and not just paying, terrorists in our jail stipends for every Jew they've killed. Literally, that's called the pay for slay. There's so many fundamental changes have to be made. This is cosmetic. The resignation of the prime minister is cosmetic at best.
Go with me on a hypothetical. I'm going way off script here. What if there were free and open elections in the Palestinian Authority? My prediction would be Hamas would actually win it, just as they did in Gaza, almost 20 years ago. That they would actually win an election in the Palestinian Authority. Do you agree with that?
Well, I think the polls would show that. They're about 85% of the Palestinians in the West Bank, Judea and Samaria support Hamas today. And I don't think even the Biden administration is talking about open elections. I've heard, rumors to the fact that they're thinking about bringing back Saad Fayyad, who was the prime minister about 12 years ago. He was a very fine individual. I worked with him. He was incorruptible, which is why the Palestinian Authority threw him out. But I ask, how would Fayyad actually get into office? The only way to be at the office would be sort of at the end of American bayonets. Who's going to keep him alive? And that's a big question. No one talks about a Palestinian state. No one talks about a democratic Palestinian state, because people know what that democracy in the West Bank would yield.
Well, let's take this hypothetical further. If there is a Palestinian state and it's, the so-called two-state solution, isn't it going to be just as radical as what we're seeing right now? Isn't it going to be dedicated to the destruction of Israel?
Well, if the leaders of that state have come through the Palestinian education system, that is, I think that's not questionable. And the vast majority of Israelis today understand this. I mean, even people who are left of center understand that a Palestinian state comes into being today, tomorrow, the day after, it's going to be a Hamas state. I live in Jaffa in South Tel Aviv, along the coast, but I look out of my rear window in my apartment, and I see the Hebron Hills. If a Palestinian state is in those hills, we will not be within rocket range. We'll be within rifle range. They can put a bullet through my rear window. And, no Israeli is going to agree to that. We frankly think it's insane.
Well, are we back into the same situation Israel's been in time and time again, where you can win the battle, but not win the peace?
Well, I think that since 1948, we've pursued a tactic, which is also our strategy. And we're in an incredibly hostile environment. And every once in a while, we have to remind our enemies that it's not a very good idea to make war against us. And some of those enemies will eventually reach the conclusion that war is not the way to go. This happened with Egypt. Egypt tried to wage not one, but 4 wars of national destruction against us. And finally, the Egyptian government concluded that this wasn't a good way to proceed. The Jordanians waged 2 wars of national destructions against us, and they concluded it was not a good way to proceed. And that was the case with the signatories of the Abraham Accord countries as well. And this is our fate. This is our destiny in the Holy Land, in the land of Israel, where occasionally we're going to have to fight to be a free people in our homeland. And in between those battles, we will continue to develop what is, by any international standards, one of the most successful nation states in the world. And we will secure our borders, sometimes at a terrible price, but we will secure them. And we will go on to be successful and a homeland for the Jewish people everywhere.
And may God bless you in that. And we applaud the startup nation. We applaud the genius of Israel. And you can be assured we stand with you in this battle, and we stand with Israel. Michael Oren, thank you so much for joining with us.
A wonderful day. It's a peaceful day.
Okay. Let me remind everyone at home, pray for the peace of Jerusalem. That's a biblical commandment. Let's follow that. Let us pray for peace in Israel. It seems far away, and in the natural, it seems impossible. But remind yourself, with God, all things are possible. Let's ask.